There's a civilization that built structures so advanced, we still can't figure out how they did it. And yet most people have never even heard their name. Why? Because someone deliberately tried to wipe them from existence. I'm talking about the Tartarian Empire. Or at least, that's what some people call it. See, if you look at old maps from the 1700s and 1800s, you'll find this massive territory labeled Tartary, or Tartaria, covering huge chunks of Asia. We're talking millions of square miles. But here's the weird part. Go pick up a modern history book and try to find anything substantial about these people. Good luck. It's like they just vanished from the historical record. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another conspiracy video, hear me out. Because whether you believe in a cover-up or not, the story of what actually happened to Tartary is genuinely fascinating. And it raises some pretty uncomfortable questions about how history gets written and who decides what we remember. So let's start with the obvious question. If Tartary was real and it was this huge empire, why don't we learn about it in school? Why isn't it common knowledge like the Roman Empire or the Mongol Empire? The mainstream explanation is actually pretty simple. Tartary wasn't really a unified empire at all. It was just a catch-all term that European mapmakers used to describe the vast, largely unknown regions of Central and Northern Asia. Kind of like how people used to label unexplored parts of maps with, "Here be dragons." They didn't actually think dragons lived there. They just didn't know what was there. According to historians, the name comes from the Tatars, which was a general term for various Turkic and Mongol tribes that lived across this massive area. European cartographers weren't great at distinguishing between all these different groups, so they just lumped everything together as Tartary. As exploration increased and knowledge improved, the term fell out of use because people realized it didn't actually describe a single unified empire or civilization. That's the official story. And honestly, it makes sense. But here's where things get interesting. If you start digging into this topic, you'll find a whole community of people who believe something else entirely. They think Tartary was a real advanced civilization that got deliberately erased from history. And they point to some genuinely puzzling evidence to back up their claims. First, let's talk about the architecture. If you look at buildings from the 1800s in places like Russia, Central Asia, and even parts of Europe and America, you'll notice something strange. There are these incredibly ornate, massively built structures with insanely detailed stonework. We're talking about buildings that would take enormous resources and advanced knowledge to construct. The thing that gets people questioning is this. Many of these buildings were supposedly constructed during times of poverty or right after major disasters. Take San Francisco, for example. After the 1906 earthquake and fire, the city was supposedly rebuilt at breakneck speed with these elaborate, beautiful buildings. How? With what resources? The official timeline doesn't always add up in people's minds. Then there's the architectural style itself. A lot of these buildings share similar features regardless of where they're located. Domed roofs, intricate facades, advanced heating systems. Some even have what look like sophisticated ventilation or energy systems built into them. The question becomes, who designed all this? And why does it look so similar across such vast distances? Now let's talk about the old photographs. If you go through archives of photos from the 1800s and early 1900s, you'll find images of enormous, beautiful buildings in various states of construction or decay. But here's what's weird. Sometimes these buildings are described as being unearthed or discovered rather than built. There are photos showing crews digging mud and debris away from first-story windows, as if these structures were somehow buried. This leads to one of the big questions in the Tartary theory. Was there some kind of massive catastrophe that buried parts of cities and killed off this advanced civilization? Some people point to what they call a mud flood, a mysterious event or series of events that supposedly devastated the world and buried countless structures. And if you look at certain old buildings, you can actually see what appears to be basement windows at ground level or doorways that seem to start halfway up a wall. The official explanation is that streets were raised over time as cities developed. But the Tartary theorists ask, why were so many streets raised? Why so much buried architecture? Let's look at another piece of the puzzle, the World's Fairs. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, cities around the world hosted these massive expositions. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 is a perfect example. For this fair, they supposedly built an entire white city of enormous, ornate buildings in just a couple of years. We're talking hundreds of structures with classical architecture, advanced electrical systems, and intricate details. The official story says these were temporary buildings made mostly of plaster and wood frames, and they were torn down after the fairs ended. But if you look at the photographs, these buildings look incredibly solid and permanent. The question people ask is, why would you build something so elaborate just to tear it down? And more importantly, How did they build all of this so quickly with the technology of the time? Some Tartary believers think these buildings weren't actually built for the pharaohs at all. They think these were existing Tartarian structures that survived whatever catastrophe destroyed the empire, and the pharaohs were just a cover story. The buildings were then demolished, not because they were temporary, but to erase evidence of the old civilization. Now let's talk about energy. Some of these old buildings have really unusual features. Ornate spires and towers. Elaborate metalwork on the roofs. Specific architectural elements that don't seem to serve an obvious decorative or structural purpose. Some researchers have theorized that these features were actually part of some kind of advanced energy system. The idea is that these buildings might have been designed to harness atmospheric electricity or some other form of free energy. There are historical records of scientists like Nikola Tesla working on wireless power transmission. What if that technology was actually much older? What if the Tartarians had figured this out long before our modern era? Of course, this is where things start to sound really far-fetched to most people. But the theorists point out that we do know ancient civilizations had technologies we still don't fully understand. Roman concrete was superior to what we used for centuries afterward. The Baghdad battery suggests ancient knowledge of electrochemical cells. Is it really impossible that advanced technology could have been lost? Let's examine the historical records themselves. When you try to research Tartary in academic sources, you hit a wall pretty quickly. There's not much there beyond the acknowledgement that it was a geographical term. But here's the thing. The term appears everywhere in old maps and documents. It wasn't some obscure reference. For hundreds of years, Tartary was a recognized name for a huge part of the world. So what happened? How does something so prominent just disappear from collective memory? The mainstream answer is that it was never really something to begin with, just a vague label for poorly understood regions. But critics point out that many other geographical terms from that era survived and evolved. Why did this one vanish so completely? Some researchers have found what they claim are deliberate attempts to obscure Tartarian history. Books that mention Tartary in earlier editions mysteriously have those references removed in later versions. Maps get redrawn with different labels. Historical accounts get rewritten or dismissed as unreliable. There's also the question of the Tartarian flag. Old sources describe a flag associated with Tartary, usually depicted as yellow or gold with an owl or dragon-like creature. But try to find definitive information about this flag in modern sources. It's surprisingly difficult. Again, the official explanation is that there wasn't really a unified Tartary to have a flag. But the symbol appears in enough historical sources to make people wonder. Let's talk about the timeline of when Tartary disappeared from maps and consciousness. It roughly coincides with the rise of modern nation-states and the redrawing of the world map during the colonial era. The 1800s saw massive political reorganization across Asia. Empires rose and fell. Borders were redrawn. History was written by the victors. Is it possible that in all this upheaval, a real civilization got deliberately written out of history? The Tartary theorists say yes. They argue that whoever came to power in these regions had reasons to erase the previous culture. Maybe it was for political control. Maybe it was to claim ownership of impressive architecture and technology. Maybe it was to hide an uncomfortable truth about a global catastrophe. Now here's where we need to talk about the actual historical peoples who lived in these regions. Because here's the thing. There definitely were civilizations in Central and Northern Asia. The problem is figuring out which ones might have been labeled as Tartary by Europeans. The Mongol Empire at its height controlled enormous territories across Asia. After it fragmented, various successor states continued for centuries. The Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Timurid Empire. These were real powerful civilizations with impressive achievements. But they're distinct entities in the historical record, not unified under a single Tartarian identity. Then there were the various Turkic peoples. The Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and many others built substantial cities and cultures across Central Asia. The Silk Road passed through these regions, creating wealthy trading cities with remarkable architecture. Could these be the Tartarians? Possibly, but again, these groups had their own distinct identities. What about Siberia and the Far East? There were indigenous peoples across these vast regions with their own cultures and histories. The problem is that many of these groups left fewer written records, making them easier to overlook or misunderstand in European sources. So here's the big question. Is it possible that some or all of these groups were once understood as part of a broader Tartarian cultural sphere? And if so, why did that understanding disappear? Let me tell you about one specific case that really makes you think. In Kazan, Russia, there's a building called the Kazan Kremlin. Within it is the Kol Sharif Mosque, a stunning example of Islamic architecture. But here's the thing. The current mosque is a reconstruction completed in 2005. The original was destroyed by Ivan the Terrible in 1552 when he conquered the city. Kazan was the capital of the Kazan Khanate, one of the successor states to the Golden Horde. This was a prosperous, advanced civilization. When Russian forces conquered it, they didn't just take over politically, they systematically destroyed or repurposed major buildings. They rewrote the cultural narrative. Within a few generations, much of the original history was obscured or lost. Now, is this proof of a Tartary cover-up? Not exactly. But it shows how easily history can be erased or rewritten when one power conquers another. It demonstrates that the deliberate destruction or obscuring of a previous civilization's achievements is not just possible, it's actually pretty common throughout history. So let's bring this all together. What's really going on with Tartary? The boring mainstream answer is that Tartary was never a single empire or civilization. It was just a catch-all term that Europeans used for regions they didn't understand well. As knowledge improved, the term became obsolete and disappeared. The impressive architecture attributed to Tartarians was actually built by various known civilizations: Russians, Mongols, Chinese, Persians, and others. There was no cover-up, no lost super-civilization, no mud flood catastrophe. But the more interesting answer, whether you fully believe it or not, is that something more complex might be going on. Maybe there was a more unified cultural sphere across Central Asia than we currently recognize. Maybe impressive technological knowledge was lost during times of war and upheaval. Maybe the way history got written did obscure or minimize certain achievements and civilizations. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Were there advanced civilizations in these regions? Absolutely. Did they have impressive architecture and technology? Yes. Did they get partly obscured or underrepresented in Western historical narratives? Quite possibly. Was there a deliberate global conspiracy to erase them entirely? That's a much bigger claim that would require much stronger evidence. Here's what we can say for certain. The regions labeled as Tartary on old maps were home to numerous sophisticated civilizations. They built impressive cities, developed technologies, created art and culture. Much of this history has been underrepresented or poorly understood in Western education. Whether you call it Tartary or by the names of specific peoples and empires, these civilizations deserve recognition. And it's worth asking why they've been so overlooked. Sometimes the answer is innocent: distance, language barriers, lack of written sources. Sometimes it's less innocent: colonialism, cultural bias, deliberate historical revisionism. The Tartary mystery reminds us of something important. History isn't objective truth handed down from on high. It's a narrative constructed by people, influenced by their perspectives, biases, and agendas. And that means there are probably gaps in our understanding. Things that got lost, overlooked, or deliberately hidden. Does that mean you should believe every alternative history theory you encounter? Of course not. A healthy dose of skepticism is important. But it also means you shouldn't assume that the mainstream narrative is complete or perfect. There are always questions worth asking, mysteries worth exploring. The old buildings are still standing in many places. The maps still exist in archives. The questions remain. And maybe that's the real point. Not to prove or disprove a specific theory, but to stay curious. To ask why our knowledge has certain gaps. To wonder what else might be out there, waiting to be rediscovered or properly understood. Because if we've learned anything from the story of Tartary, it's this: civilizations can be forgotten. Knowledge can be lost. And sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that almost disappeared completely. If this got you thinking, check out the next video where we explore more erased history.